Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of The Report, a political show covering the latest news and election news to bring it to you right on time. This episode is the Almanac of American Politics special, and we're very, very excited to have two long-awaited guests, both of whom write for the Almanac and are senior authors. The first guest we're going to have on tonight is Mr. Lou Jacobson, senior author at the Almanac of American Politics. He is a senior correspondent for PolitiFact. He is a regular contributor to the Cook Political Report, Sabato's Crystal Ball, and U.S. News and World Report. Since 2002, Lou has handicapped political races, including races for Congress, governor, state legislature, other state offices, and the Electoral College. Lou has served as deputy editor of Roll Call and as the founding editor of its legislative wire service, Congress Now. Earlier, Lou spent more than a decade as a reporter covering Congress, politics, and lobbying for the National Journal. Lou has also written parts of 6 almanacs since 2000. Our second guest is going to be Jessica Taylor, the first female senior author of the Almanac of American Politics. She is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report. For more than 14 years, she has reported on and analyzed congressional and gubernatorial elections. Jessica previously served as a political reporter for NPR for 5 years. She has been the campaign editor at The Hill and has reported for the NBC News political unit, Inside Elections, National Journal, The Hotline, and Politico. She has served as an election night analyst for CBS and C-SPAN and has appeared on MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN. Jessica was an intern on the 2008 Almanac of American Politics and later served as research director for the 2010 edition. So welcome, Lou and Jessica, and welcome Eric as well, our co-host and comments moderator. First, I'm going to throw it off to Lou to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his contributions to the Almanac.
Sure. So the Almanac, the 2022 edition is not this one. This is the 2020 edition. It's going to come out in about 2 weeks, back from the printer. And this is the 4th consecutive Almanac that I've written for. And as in most of the previous ones in that 4-book cycle, I have written basically all of the state overview chapters and all of the gubernatorial profiles. I switched off one gubernatorial profile for the Joe Manchin Senate profile, but other than that, basically, I did those chapters in the past couple of books. And why don't I turn it over to Jessica to explain what she wrote?
Yeah, thanks for having me. They mentioned, I feel like I've kind of come full circle with the Almanac. I ended up being an intern kind of inadvertently right after college when a friend of mine that was working on the book took another job during the 2008 election, and they asked if I could fill in. And, I had been familiar and had used the Almanac in college and kind of got thrown right in there. And then they asked if I'd stay on as research director. So it was my very first real job in politics. And then Rich Cohen, who is our leader and editor and the senior, the main author, who I'd worked with and been a researcher for, again, directing the research at that book, asked last cycle if I would come on as a contributing author. So that was my first cycle writing. And then this cycle I was very happy to up my contributions. I ended up writing almost half of the Senate profiles, and hopefully that will grow. But I think being the 50th anniversary, it's just been fun to look back at sort of the old editions, and sadly some of mine are still in my office that we're not able to get into much. So I'm hoping I can go in and rescue some of them at some point, depending on how much longer I'm working from home. Not that I have a lot of room here to put them anyway. But I know one of the things we're really trying to do is, there haven't been a lot of women contributing in the past beyond researchers. So, there's myself and also we have two other contributing authors, Abby Livingston and Ali Mutnick, who have done some house profiles and different things. So we're trying to diversify that, especially as we, move to our 50th anniversary and try to make it, more representative, I think, of not just the country, but I think of the people that use the Almanac and things too.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Now we're going to move on to a discussion about the history of the Almanac, on which you are both obviously knowledgeable. So this can really be just you passing off the discussion. Where do you want to start?
So, well, as Jessica said, it's the 50th anniversary this year. The book is titled basically a year before it comes out. So the 2022 book actually comes out in 2021. So I guess that the first one actually came out in 1971. It was the 72 edition. I was born in 1970, so I was 1 year old when the first one came out. And it was started by a guy, Michael Barone, who actually, when you see the book for 2022, he's got a really nice essay just sort of talking about how the book came about and how he kind of put it together. He and a couple of his buddies, if I recall correctly, thought that there was going to be a nice little market for the anti-war protesters back in the Vietnam era, to basically lobby Congress and, who are these guys? What's their background? How do you reach them in terms of trying to get your point across? So he spent a lot of time putting together this book. It came out, and it was kind of a hit, I guess. I'm not sure, how many copies that one sold, but it's come out every 2 years since then. At some point, I think in the late 80s or the early 90s, National Journal magazine bought the rights to it. And all of us, including Jessica and me, certainly most of us, have spent significant time at National Journal, and that's kind of how we got involved in it. I started for the 2000 book around 1999. I wrote some of the House district descriptions when I was a staff writer at the magazine, and did this, in my spare time. And so National Journal had the book up until well, they still have it technically, but in 2014, in 2015 for the 2016 edition, they basically licensed out the rights to Columbia Books. Columbia Books continues to publish us. It's a publisher that has a couple other research and kind of reference titles, including Washington Representatives and some of the Capitol handbooks. So they've done for the past 4 editions. And Michael Barone he's had a hand in most of the recent editions, often writing like the presidential chapter, but certainly in the last 4 editions, since it's gone over to the folks at Columbia Books, Rich Cohen has been the primary author. Somehow he manages to write 435, or well, no, not quite 435, but most of the House districts. Some of those are now shared with some of the other writers, and a bunch of the Senate profiles as well, and does a lot in terms of just getting all the numbers and the databases correct, and the lists. And so he by far does the biggest chunk of the writing and the editing. Our co-author is Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report, who also Jessica and I both do stuff for as well. He's got he's usually written kind of an overview chapter, often a fairly lengthy one, and he's got one again for this year, which I have not actually read yet.
He has 3 overviews.
He has 3 of them. Wow. Okay,
3.
I haven't read them yet. Have you read them?
Our team has, yes.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so Charlie is the co-author, and then Lou Peck and I and Jessica are the 3 senior authors. Lou Peck and Jessica together write the bulk of the Senate profiles. Lou Peck also is National Journal alum. He had been the editor of Congress Daily, so he's covered Congress for a long time. And then, as we said, we have a couple of additional writers, Cam Joseph, Ali Mutnick, and Abby Livingston, who write a combination of some of the presidential chapters and, as Cam has done, and some of the House seats and House districts.
One thing that I've even just observed, in the past, 14 years since I, came on as an intern, I think, is the way that our research process has changed. Because again, when I started there, I guess it was for the 2008 edition. So I was working there in 2007, right after I graduated college. And I mean, we were still, it was not a lot of news sites were online, or if they were, the most recent articles were not on there. So we were using a lot of LexisNexis and different things and searching. And we actually printed everything out and would go through and highlight everything. And then we would deliver those for that book. The primary authors were Rich, who was the congressional correspondent there at National Journal at the time. And then Michael Barone was still involved in writing a lot of the profiles at that point. And, those of us who were researchers had to deliver the bulk of papers. So every few weeks, one of us would take turns and we would deliver just, copy boxes full of folders to them. Now everything is done online and Google Docs and different things. So we've moved into the 21st century, and the articles, you can link to them. It's much easier and certainly more environmentally friendly. Certainly. But one of the things that when I read Michael Barone's chapter about the Almanac, because one of my favorite things I think about the Almanac that I think makes it so readable in a way, that it's not just a traditional research book, is I think especially the district profiles, which have to be they're going to have to be revised next year too, after redistricting too, which is not an easy haul to do, certainly, depending upon how much these districts change. But just the color that they have and different things. And he goes into how sort of they did that, because again, there was no internet back then. There were no news sites, that they would go down to the local newsstand and get copies of all of the local papers and kind of consolidate them that way. So it does have this, the boys on the bus feel to it, where you feel like you're there, and that he can talk about sort of the rich history. And I think that's sort of Michael's, his major influences on the book, that, a lot of that has stayed as we certainly freshen up. And for the last book, I did a lot of House. I did primarily House and the district profiles, along with a couple of senators. And then once I moved into my role at Cook, obviously the Senate made a little more sense, although I covered House districts back in my day. So, was certainly happy to help with that at the time. But Senate certainly made a lot more sense for my contributions this year. And, we'll add new things, certainly, but those are some of my favorite things to read. Or I think the district profiles, they really give you a sense of, you feel like you're getting a pretty good snapshot of what this place looks like, what it feels like.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that. I have a special fondness for the House district descriptions as well. My first two books, the 2000 and 2004 editions, I was responsible for those district descriptions in the House, and I was able to draw on travel that I'd done. Back in my crazy National Journal days, before I was married and had two kids, I traveled to write freelance stories around the country in my vacation time, and my goal was to file a story from every state. And in basically a 7-year period, I filed a copy from 48 states. And a lot of that experience went into the chapters that I wrote in terms of the House districts. And it was really just the best assignment you could possibly imagine. Those are the parts that I think, along with the state overview chapters that I write now, are really kind of a special, unique part of the Almanac. For a long time, CQ had a publication called Politics in America. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was kind of a direct competitor. I think people had just a stronger affection for the Almanac, because it was written by a much smaller number of people. The CQ volume was written by probably 20, 30, 40 people together collaborating. And it was much more sort of nuts and bolts, kind of granular, whereas the Almanac, thanks to Michael's kind of framing of it for so long, had a sort of unitary voice for one thing, and really a sort of narrative style in how they painted these portraits of the districts. And I think that that's continued to be one of the big draws of it. And it's going to be interesting next year because, over the sort of decade-long period, it goes in these cycles where for the books ending in 4, that's the first of the new districts after redistricting and apportionment. And as Jessica said, that's just a real challenge because you have these old district descriptions and you have to figure out, okay, by checking maps, if we talk about a factory or a landmark, is that still in the same district? If not, you got to take that part out and put it in a separate district description. I was involved in that process for the 2004 book, and it was really challenging. I wrote, I think, 134 district descriptions that cycle. But as Jessica said, I mean, that was back in the days of the printouts, and each district was like this tall in terms of printout. And it's a little bit better now that it's online, but it's going to be a whole challenge to get all that together, particularly given all the problems of the census and the delays with that.
Mm-hmm. And I can say from my own personal perspective that, always when I go back and read district profiles, it's really useful, to know the district back then, but it's also they're really useful, especially if you go back to them in the past and see how districts have evolved and they've changed and how they've stayed the same in a lot of ways. When I go back and read profiles of my old district, before I moved counties and so I moved districts this time, but when I go back and read them, the old one, there's a lot in there that's the same, but there's also stuff that's kind of changed. The emphasis is of what's going on and what the major economic centers are even in just 10 years. That can all change significantly, and that gives you a really good impact of just looking back and comparing it to right now. I think it's just a very valuable service. And
there is just a plethora of sources now, databases, census data, poverty data, all kinds of things that we can use and do update from book to book, which is very easy to access. It's sometimes hard to sort of manipulate as we need it, but it's all online, and that's something we couldn't do 20-some years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to view the district descriptions as a picture being painted, really, and it honestly is almost artistic in a way when you read them. I mean, just from reading all the various editions about my home state in New Jersey, especially, for example, the 2nd district, which is in South Jersey, they literally talk about the vegetable fields, the farms, and then the diversity, along the Delaware River, the working class communities of Philadelphians who fled Philadelphia. It's very fascinating to read it all. And I'm excited to see the 2022 edition when it comes out compared to the 2020 edition. It's always interesting to see how the districts change from book to book. And I think this is a good time as well to introduce the discount code for the 2022 edition for our viewers. And you can see it right here. It's a 15% off discount, Almanac Tweet 22. And it's important to note that you have to use a discount on the Almanac of American Politics website, not on a third-party vendor where you could buy it. But yep. They're generous enough to provide this discount code before we move on.
We'll also, if you go to that website too, I believe it's on August 18th, if I'm remembering correctly, that we are going to be having, if you purchase a book, then you will also be invited to a free online panel that we're having with all of the authors, talking about some of our contributions, our takeaways, and different things. And my Cook colleague, Amy Walter, will be moderating that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of good people on I didn't realize, I kind of scrolled through the authors. I didn't realize Allie Mutnick was on there. I followed her on Twitter for a while of, her coverage at Politico is really, really good. These are all really, really good contributors here.
I was really excited that she came on board. She was one of my interns when I was at NPR, and she's a complete star. So again, as someone that got started in House races I remember when she was leaving NPR and she asked me about taking a job at Hotline covering House races, and I was like, do it. I also think, when I sort of jumped into this right after college, when I knew I wanted to do political journalism, that this is what sort of made me really want to get more into handicapping and more granular than just, breaking political news stories. Because it really is someone, I don't know who said this, but it's sort of an adage that a lot of us have that have worked at the Almanac, have been researchers on the Almanac at least, will say is that it's sort of like getting your master's in politics. It really is, because you're learning so much, you're reading all of this stuff, and I mean, you get paid to do it, and it's sort of like baptism by fire. But I mean, it prepared me incredibly well for, my career, and eventually led me first to Inside Elections, formerly Rutherford Political Report, where I did handicapping there, and then I joined the Political Report part-time 2 years ago, and then full-time about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm. And if you missed the code on the screen, you can still see it in the comments. We have it in the comment section.
And the website link as well, so you can access both of those.
Yep.
So with that, I think we're going to move on to the next section, discussing some of the critical Senate races next year, because there are quite a few fascinating Senate races up on the Class 3 map. And this is going to formulate the bulk of our discussion. So there's really anywhere we can start, anywhere we can go with this. And I know we're certainly probably going to have some questions at the end that deal with these Senate races. So I guess I'll throw it over to Jessica first, because she covers Senate races for the Cook Political Report.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is really, I think, an interesting Senate map. I mean, it's an interesting Senate cycle, which it feels like is kind of cliche to say, given that you have a 50-50 Senate, and the Senate is absolutely up for grabs. So, it's sort of certainly, we're in sort of our, multiple cycles now of the Senate certainly being in play. I think that, Republicans are a tiny bit more overexposed than Democrats are. 20 Republican seats up compared to 14 for Democrats. But I think what's causing some headaches early on is the number of open seats that Republicans are already having. We already knew, even before the 2020 election, that Pennsylvania and North Carolina were going to be open, because Senator Toomey and Senator Byrd already sort of telegraphed their expectations there. The one that took me completely by surprise, and a lot of people, was Rob Portman in Ohio. We were actually on a Zoom staff meeting at that point, and I wasn't completely paying attention to my Twitter enough. And I think Amy saw it, and she was like, "Oh, Rob Portman is retiring." And then I was emailing everyone, and I don't remember what was said for the rest of that staff meeting. The other ones, I think, a little less so. We'll see in Missouri, certainly. If Greitens wins, I think that's a complete headache for them. But Democrats don't have much of a bench there when, you have Jason Kander passing Haskell. This is a state that has gotten redder. And, Jay Nixon kind of seems to be like the Hail Mary possibly, but I just don't think he's going to do it. And also, red state Democratic governors have not had a good track record in trying to make the jump to the Senate. And then, Alabama, I think this one is more so, listen, it's not going to turn blue. It was not even competitive with Doug Jones in the general election. And I think back to that 2017 special election, certainly. And he only barely won against a guy that was accused of, sexual misconduct with minors. So that's where Alabama is. But I think it's what type of Republican emerges from here. And that's going to affect so much of how the Senate will or will not function. You have someone like Mo Brooks that Trump has very quickly endorsed, which is, an interesting turn, given that he was sort of persona non grata in that 2017 primary. That would be just a complete thorn in Mitch McConnell's side, and, align himself with the Josh Hawleys and Ted Cruz's and different things, or someone, like Katie Britt, who raised just an astounding number, 2.2 million, I think it was, in just 3 weeks of campaigning. She obviously has a lot of business ties, and she's always sort of been seen as Senator Shelby's, that she was his chief of staff, his natural successor, or his preferred successor, rather. So you have those two competing interests, though, too, there. And then this Senate primary may end up being the bane of my existence as well, because there is another candidate running whose name is also Jessica Taylor. So it's been interesting. I've already gotten tagged on Twitter and different things. And I had one source actually that meant to text her and texted me something instead. So, you can keep that up if you'd like. Sources. So you have those races, and then, and I think of those, Pennsylvania, I think is the top picking for Democrats to flip. Excuse me. Of course, one of two states that are held right now, the Biden one, where a Republican is. And of course, we've seen such a correlation, almost parliamentary. I mean, it can be a little bit different when in midterm cycles when the presidential race is not on the ballot, but the fact that only Susan Collins was able to sort of defy that, the presidential result going along with the Senate result. So I think Pennsylvania, and especially when you look at, I think the Republican field there too, that seems very in the mold of Trump, and as a lot of these primaries are becoming, is their best shot to flip a seat. And then, one of the races that we moved the rating on last week was Ron Johnson into toss-up. And, we've gotten questions about some of our ratings, the way we do things before. We don't move an incumbent into toss-up until they have a challenger. And so, this was a culmination of, there had been, certainly Alex Lasry was one of the first to get in that I think was a legitimate candidate, Sarah Godlewski, the treasurer. And then, we had an inkling certainly that this week, as he did this morning, that Mandela Barnes, which I think was sort of the elephant or donkey perhaps in the room that a lot of people were waiting on. I'm going to have something deeper on Wisconsin in this week's newsletter, actually looking at that primary. So I think it's going to be an interesting one. But I think Mandela Barnes is, his story, and he's been seen as a rising star within the party for quite some time. But then, for Godlewski, Emily's list is already endorsed there. So you've kind of got some competing, factions of the Democratic Party that I think can make it an interesting race. But I kind of see Barnes, Godlewski, and Lasry in large part because of the money that he would be able to put into sort of the top tier in that contest. We also moved Florida from likely into lean after Val Demings got in. And, we consider our competitive races in a toss-up or lean category. It's a much bigger, I think, call to prove when we move a seat from lean into toss-up, which is typically what we wait to do until we see, when there's polling, when we're in an election year, when there's things. It's hard to, a lot of these ratings, the initial ratings are the hardest ones to do because you're sort of basing it on past, electoral history, trends in the state, and different things too. But this is so early when we don't know all the candidates or who's going to make it or what type of candidate they're going to end up being, and different things too. But I think Deming's got a huge, gift there when absolutely, Stephanie Murphy had been preparing a campaign, and Democrats are much better at clearing their primaries than Republicans are, whether officially or unofficially. And so the fact that she does appear to have that sort of feel to herself, raising, an impressive haul, but, spending a lot to raise a lot too. She's obviously done a lot of Facebook advertising and different things too. Rubio had good numbers too, though. So, this is going to be a really expensive race, but Florida has been sort of the white whale for Democrats, at least the past few election cycles. They've come very close, but then the Democratic Party there is pretty anemic. There were close races in 2018, certainly, but this is, I think, going to be incumbent upon Demings to sort of build a strong field operation there too, certainly. And I would have thought, actually, I did think at the beginning of the cycle that in my mind that DeSantis was probably more vulnerable than Rubio, but I'm kind of beginning to switch my thinking about that when we've seen some of DeSantis's numbers improve. And I also think it's a weaker primary field on the governor side right now than in the Senate side. We've had Ohio in lean since it became open. That is just a messy Republican primary. another place where Tim Ryan has a clear shot there, so he can start making money, having his message where, the Republican field is just trying to out-Trump themselves. And then, the other trend that I see here is, listen, Georgia and Arizona should be Democrats' Republicans' top two targets to win back. Narrow wins. Kelly a little bit less narrow than Warnock, certainly, but even that race was a little closer than polling showed. And we've seen, in some of the exit polls and analyses that have come out since then, too, that Democrats had a weakness with especially Hispanic male voters there, too. But I think we've seen certainly both the Georgia and Arizona Republican parties not learn the lessons of their changing and evolving states and are sort of reaching toward, nominating more Trumpian far-right type candidates. And, in Arizona, I have a hard time seeing how you win this race with a candidate that's going to try to be more conservative than Martha McSally. And also McSally, I think part of it was that she never seemed genuine because she was not, a hardline conservative when she was first elected by any means. She was actually a very impressive candidate. I remember interviewing her when she was running for Congress in 2012, and she was just an incredibly impressive person, and they didn't really tell her bio. She just sort of had to sort of cater to Trump and the Trump crowd, and that got lost, in order to win that primary in 2018, and she was never able to recover from that, I think. So, there's a lot of candidates running in that Arizona race as well. Senator Scott said, he was on a Briefless podcast today, said that, they don't feel like they've given up on Ducey, which is what I was sort of hearing from a lot of sources I was talking to last week too, that, Ducey will say publicly that, he's not interested, but they do feel like there's an opening there sort of more quietly in the back channels. So, but, you have Trump attacking him at every turn. I don't see how he can win a Republican primary, really, and still be the type of really strong candidate that he would be there. And this is it. Trump's never been restrained, but he was a little more restrained in going after candidates that the party clearly wanted when they were in the White House. There were people, I think, that could direct him toward, this is what's best for us electorally. You don't have that anymore. He doesn't have Twitter, but those of us that are on his press list still, we get like a dozen emails a day at least that are essentially tweets in press release form. So he's still making those judgments. How much, and those attacks, how much saliency that has when he doesn't have his Twitter platform. I'm a little doubtful, but it's still going to make it into local news stories and stuff there, of course, when he, attacks the sitting governor. And then in Georgia, really, the field has been frozen by waiting for Herschel Walker. I will fully admit that Herschel Walker was the greatest, one of the, if not the greatest college football player of all time. And to acknowledge that for a University of Georgia player as a diehard University of Tennessee fan is really hard for me to do. But I think I question, and I know a lot of Republicans I've talked to in the state do too, about what really are his qualifications to run for Senate, and what type of candidate he would be. And, there's some minefields about, he's been open about his struggle with mental health. And I think that should be commended, certainly. And I do think there's a fine line Democrats would have to walk if they talk about some of those, incidents that he's had, famously the one where he held a gun up to his wife's head, that I'm sure will come in there somehow. But, I think that kind of is an interesting balancing act. But, that everyone else in the state, largely, the Agriculture Commissioner, Gary Black, has already come in there. But largely the field just seemed frozen. And meanwhile, in both cases, Warnock and Kelly just continue raising astounding sums of money and building their bank account. And then the other two races that we moved were from likely to lean, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, and then in Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto. And these were really ones that I will not say anything one thing prompted us to move those, but I think it was just sort of a stepping back and taking another look at the map and the fact that both Democrats regard these as competitive races they're having to prepare for. I think New Hampshire depends. Obviously, Kristen Sununu would be the slam dunk, probably the best recruit they would get overall. Sources I talked to in New Hampshire do ultimately think he will run. And I think that I think that would more than likely move into a toss-up scenario if that's the case. And I had several sources on both sides tell me they believe that New Hampshire would probably be a better pickup opportunity than Arizona or Georgia at this point, just given the strength of the candidate. I think this is a place where candidate strength could really make a difference. Hassan's, of course, had some very, very close race there in 2016 in Rayot. And Cortez Masto, I think it is. Nevada, I think it's a little bit more of a reputation as, this is a blue state, but very close election in 2020 with the presidential results. So that was more of an indication that, former Attorney General Adam Laxalt is expected to get in there pretty soon, per my sources. I don't think he's he's not a particularly strong candidate, I don't think. More so than sort of a generic Republican candidate. And I do think that in a midterm year, it could be a little tougher. But Governor Sandoval would have been the strongest candidate there if they could have recruited him into the race too. But I think it's the same thing. You have a lot of these even Republican governors that are sort of turned off by the Trump turn of the party. Chairman Scott also said today he still doesn't think the door is closed on Larry Hogan running in Maryland. I have a really hard time seeing that. I think sort of the opposite could be true here, that, in the same way that we have seen Democratic governors in red states, again, I'm from Tennessee, I think Phil Bredesen, and my parents are incredibly Republican, and they voted for Phil Bredesen twice. I remember growing up. In large part because Don Sunquist was kind of a disaster there toward the end. And I asked them, I was like, are you going to vote for him for Senate? And they were like, no, we're voting for the Republican. Right? And so I think that's an instance of where just the Senate elections have become so parliamentary in a way that you are voting for the party and not necessarily the person, even if you still like the person. Or my dad saying, I like Phil Bredesen. I think he was a good governor. I'm not going to send him to the Senate, because of the Senate, if you're a governor, you're not voting with a party. You're sort of acting more unilaterally, and different things. So those are some of the major trends and sort of our thinking behind, our recent moves. We have, we have 9 seats right now in the competitive category, which is about on par with what we've all been, but some of these other states, I do wonder if both parties will kind of take a step back because, longer shot races that the Democrats certainly tried to put on the board last time, like South Carolina, Mississippi, Montana, didn't work out so well. So are we going to stay with sort of a smaller competitive universe this time? Will there sort of be a surprise in a way too? That's sort of what I'm looking at the next couple of months too.
Mm-hmm. And I did have one comment, or a couple of comments specifically before we go over to Lou real quick. One is North Carolina. You didn't mention, but we'll go over it a little bit later. But no, but it's an entire different universe, and then it's kind of a very different primary from what Pennsylvania and these other ones have, because it's a wide field on both sides. The Republicans, I think Pat McCrory is a front runner for now, even though there's still a year to go. His fundraising, his polling is good, but on the Democratic side in particular, not so much a difference in messaging, but there's certainly not a clear favorite like there was when the last time when it was Cunningham.
Yeah, I think Jeff Jackson obviously got in there very soon. He had a good first quarter. I think his second quarter was less impressive. Sort of went downhill there too after Sherry Beasley got in. She's clearly the favorite, I think, of Democrats up here in D.C. And I think this is sort of the Warnock way too, that you have a black candidate that can fight the base too. The fact that there are no black women in the Senate, U.S. Senate right now too either. after Senator Harris became Vice President Harris. But I think what Jeff Jackson unfortunately has going is that he is a moderate veteran legislator who has good hair and bears a striking resemblance to Cal Cunningham in many ways. And, whether he would have won without, the sex scandal that popped up, I think it could have been closer than it was, but given that Biden lost the state too, I don't think that Cal was necessarily going to outperform Biden necessarily. So I do see the Democrats moving away from that. It's also notable to me that the DSCC that has had a pretty heavy hand in primaries is not endorsing yet. They're taking a little more time. Now they have not taken endorsing off the table, and I think that they will on some of these places. And I think North Carolina is a place where that could happen with Beasley, but it's not going to happen as quickly as it did last time. And I think, I see on the Republican side, McCrory got in. He has the most name ID, obviously, too, but he's never run in a race in the Trump era where Trump has fully taken over the party. And, of course, Trump carried the state while McCrory lost in 2016. And, with Bud getting Trump's endorsement, I think the person that hurt the most is Mark Walker. So I kind of see both of those as a two-person race at this point. But
But the interesting thing, though, with that North Carolina race, just to close off on that, is I think for the first time in a while, it may not be the most expensive Senate race. It's going back to 1984 with Jesse Helms and the former governor. I don't know how I'm forgetting his name on air, but I'm sorry,
Hunt.
Yeah, Jim Hunt. Yeah, the longest serving. The North Carolina Democrat. Since then, North Carolina Senate races have usually been, if not the most expensive, one of them. I think this time you look at Arizona, you look at Florida, even just the small money. I'm not convinced North Carolina will be the most expensive this time. It's been kind of a white whale. It's been a white whale for Democrats, similar to Florida, except it's been even worse because it's been more competitive than Florida. It's been so close to flipping. Yeah, I did an analysis this a while back, but the Republican and Democratic counties in North Carolina have almost the exact same number of people. It's a politically polarized state, and so it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of this primary and what the approach is, because whatever Democrats are doing clearly isn't working. This is also a state Trump won twice. That McCrory won once and lost, but he also kind of lost due to support in the West being weaker for him, especially in the mountains, North Carolina 11. That was the current lines. He would have almost lost that district. So. To Cooper. So I want to go a little bit into that because it is one of the more interesting races in the cycle.
I do think what Democrats are trying to do differently is not run these white moderate men. Energize the base in a different way. And so I think that's why, they are excited about Beasley. She very narrowly lost that Chief Justice race, but she outperformed Biden and Cunningham in many places. She didn't outperform Cooper, of course, but was much closer to his numbers than the other people were. So, but she's never run this, high profile of a race that's going to become nationalized either.
Yeah. And there was that blunder, the infamous kind of blunder at the end of during the recount of her initial strategy of contesting specific ballots that almost exclusively lean Democratic. I know for a fact Republicans are going to go after that.
Yeah.
The state newspapers in particular reported on it. It was not ideal at the time. If that hadn't happened, I think she'd be a much better position. It does at least give Republicans a little bit of oppo right off the bat for an otherwise kind of fairly spotless resume in terms of what you want from a political candidate. Yeah. Especially trying to recuperate voters out in the East where they've been hemorrhaging.
Yeah. I just want to make sure
some of her judicial decisions, I think, too, are certainly going to become hotter too.
Before we move on to the next segment, I just want to make sure that we give Lou some time to speak on these Senate races. Do you have anything? I know Jessica did a wonderful job of going over all the big picture stuff, but do you have anything major you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I mostly defer to Jessica on this. I will point out one thing. I just filed a piece for U.S. News, so it's not out yet, but it's a column that I've done every midterm cycle around this time, looking at the states that have both a competitive Senate race and a competitive governor's race, and the sort of top tier of these dual races I find are 4 states, which are going to be familiar for the 2020 presidential election, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. They have both competitive governors and Senate races this year. Second tier would probably be Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, and what's the other one? Anyway, Florida, Michigan, Nevada. Wait, I'm sorry. I've told you. Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, and Ohio is the second tier. But that top tier, I think, is really interesting. Part of what I did in the column was I looked back at every midterm going back to 2006, and looked at what the Cook Report had as the competitive contest. The states that had two of the competitive contests, and overall during that period, that's 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018. So 4 different midterm cycles. There were 33 races. I think it's 33 that fit that category. And about 1/3 of them were splits, and about 2/3 the same party won the 2 races in each state. And over time, the likelihood that those 2 races would diverge has declined. In 2018, there were 6 such contests and only 1 split, and that was Ohio. The other 5 states, Florida, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the same candidate won both contests, which just goes to show the degree to which Senate and gubernatorial races, even though there are reasons why they might diverge, as we were saying with some of the other states where the state issues are a little bit different, the state level issues and dynamics are different than the federal ones. It's just becoming less and less common. You see fewer states now with senators of different parties or senators and governors of different parties. So
we've only got 2 of those right now, as far as I know. Of the 2 that are up at the same time, we've got Wisconsin and we got Pennsylvania. It'd be very unlikely to see the Senate and the governor both flip, because then that'd be a Republican to Democrat. It'd be a flip on both ends.
It's actually fascinating to look at. I've been working on a piece about the decline in ticket splitting in Senate races during presidential cycles for Elections Daily. And I've basically taken a look at each cycle from 1992 to the present in the presidential year. And similar to what Lou was talking about with the comparison between the gubernatorial results and the Senate results, I mean, yes, gubernatorial results are in a way a lot less federalized than the Senate races, and therefore you're more likely to see deviation. But even as recently as 1992, we're talking about 13, 14 or more Senate races that split between the presidential result and the Senate result. And that goes on pretty reliably. Even as recently as 2012, you had 6 states where essentially you had Democratic senators either elected or reelected while the state voted for Romney. And, in 2016, 0. No deviation, and only Susan Collins in 2020. And I actually think that this plays really well into our next segment. And this is where Lou has great expertise of looking at how the 2022 results are going to impact 2024, because there are a lot of Democratic incumbents on what is certainly, whatever perspective you look at it from, a bad map for the Democrats. And these Democratic incumbents, if they run, are going to be running in, frankly, red states in a presidential year. And I think it plays beautifully into what we were just talking about with the general decline in ticket splitting.
Yep. Can I add one thing there, Harrison, before we go to Lou?
Of course.
I looked at sort of the governor's results and compared them to the most recent presidential results too. And in 2008, there were 18 governors that represented a party that was different from the most recent presidential result. After 2020, that's only now 10. So we're seeing a decline there too. It's not as marked. There's still a fifth there that's different, but not up to almost over a fourth there.
And the fifth is that's the predictable fifth. It's the New England states, which are always willing to take a split for Republicans that are moderate to liberal, and then a couple of states in the South, like Louisiana, for example, which have shown a traditional tendency to be a little bit more open to, or in Kentucky, for example.
Certainly,
but those are certainly less likely to last long term in a lot of ways than some of those New England ones.
Right. I mean, it's not clear to me that there's a Republican who could take over for Larry Hogan in Maryland, or that there's one who could take over for Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, or Phil Scott in Vermont. These are sort of unicorns in a way, and they've done very well, been very popular. But if they're either term limited out or they decide to step down, who else is going to fill that bill? It's very hard.
And it's hard to see lieutenant governors rising up to the challenge too. Like Boyd Rutherford, I think he's declined to run in Maryland.
Right.
Karen Polito, again, it's hard to see whether or not she would have anywhere close to the same appeal as Baker. And Vermont elects the lieutenant governor separately. They just elected, I think, the first female statewide office holder to the lieutenant governorship in Vermont.
Yeah.
I think Baker's actually started calling it, like, in some ways, the Baker-Polito administration to try and make her a little bit more visible publicly.
Yeah, because it's not clear if he's going to run for a third term. But that isn't competitive if Charlie Baker runs again. But if he doesn't, it absolutely is.
Nonetheless, I want to make sure we get to governors later, so I'll throw the floor completely to Lou to talk about his 2 articles, both of which are very interesting. They're linked in the comment section, so you can go give them a read.
Yeah, so one of them is from Sabato's Crystal Ball. This was actually last year, but it's pretty timeless. I looked at the 3 classes of senators, the third of the chamber that is up every 2 years, and then it starts over again. The 2020 class and the 2022 class are fairly favorable towards the Democrats. Things get really nasty for the Democrats in 2024. I did a little ranking, a sort of analysis of the people who are up in 2024 for each party, and both in sheer numbers. I think there's only it's almost twice as many, I think, Democrats who are up in 2024. But even more so than that, I looked at a couple of factors and sort of gave points allocated to a couple different factors. Was the senator of state won in 2016, because I'd done it before the 2020 election? Was it won in 2016 on the presidential level by the opposite party? Was the state thought to be competitive in the 2020 presidential vote? Is the other senator in the same state from the different party than the senator? Will the senator be 75 or over, meaning they might step down and leave an open seat? And did they win their seat by 5 points or less the last time that they were up in 2018? And then I sort of total up all those points as so-called vulnerability points. And if you look at the GOP map for 2024, only 3 senators had any vulnerability points at all, and a total of 5 points. By contrast, for Democrats, there were 16 senators who had at least 1 vulnerability point. So that's 16 compared to 3. And then the total number of points, vulnerability points, for those Democratic senators was 32 compared to the 5 for the GOP. So we're talking really, really bad situation, landscape for the Democrats in the Senate in 2024. So basically, 2022, which is not a bad map for the Democrats, is really their biggest chance to get a couple of points on the board before they're almost certain to face some losses in 2024.
Mm-hmm. And there's exactly 2 states Democrats can target in 2024. I mean, you can't really count Missouri just as a generic incumbent, I don't think, at this point, but they would be Texas and Florida, both of which Texas hasn't elected a Democrat statewide since the 90s.
Yep.
And Florida is a problematic state for them in a lot of ways. The rest of the states, your Arizona's, your Nevada, Ohio, Montana, West Virginia, is just beyond brutal. Before we even get to the hardcore competitive, the blue wall states.
Yep. And that's even so the last time this class was up was in 2018, and I think in 2018 they lost 3 senators, right?
Yeah, they lost 2. They lost Nevada and they lost Arizona.
Okay, yeah.
And then Republicans gained, Republicans gained 2 because they won North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana and Florida while losing Arizona and
it
Nevada.
was already a bad map.
Four Democratic incumbents
Right.
lost.
So this map is actually less bad than it was in 2018.
It could have
already
been
pre-locked North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana.
Yeah. I mean, to get what we're talking about here, I mean, we're looking at 3 states Republicans would be very favored to flip if it were just an open race, so generic open race in Montana, West Virginia, Ohio. You can count the incumbents and then whatever, but those are certainly Republican-leaning states at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get the Arizona, which is a state that has voted for Republicans for quite a while. Mm-hmm. Then you get your Nevada, your Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New Mexico as like stretch goals. Yeah. Like if worse comes to worse, this could be one of the most brutal Senate cycles since 2008 in terms of what is on the table, or 2014 for that matter. Yeah. And just now, granted, once these states are gone, Democrats don't have to worry about competing in West Virginia again for a pretty long time, if ever. But for now, you want to keep that state. You don't want to lose it.
Yep. And of course, if Manchin steps down, then it's basically gone to the GOP.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I think I wonder the same thing about Ohio, too, with Sherrod Brown. If they actually convince him to stay on and run again, even then it would be a tough race in a presidential year. But if he does step down, the question really is, assuming Tim Ryan doesn't ultimately win, which is a general expectation this fall, who are the Democrats going to run statewide?
Yeah.
Tim Ryan.
Tim Ryan, exactly.
It's kind of like a reverse Nevada in a way, where the Democrats are increasingly finding themselves at a loss, really, with a statewide base that's not as potent as it would have been, say, a decade ago.
Yeah, for sure.
But I'll leave it open for you to discuss your second article. I think Jessica wants to add something first.
So the second article is about the filibuster, or it sort of jumped off from the question of the filibuster. And so what I wanted to do here is, as we were talking about a few moments ago, there is such a correlation between the Senate races and the presidential races in each of the states. And so I kind of tried to find the long-term equilibrium for each party in the Senate by looking at what states are solidly red and solidly blue. And I would give 2 Senate seats in each of those states to the party that was dominant. And then for the more like battleground states, I gave 1 seat to each party. So if you do the math, it basically works out to be the sort of long-term equilibrium if those partisan loyalties stay the same, and it looks like they will. Things can change over very long periods of time. That basic long-term equilibrium works out to be about 53 seats for the GOP and 47 for the Dems. So to sort of put this in context, if you think about the current 50-50, or it's a Democratic edge, but it's a 50-50 tie, to get that edge to actually be the Democratic majority. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find the exact point where I had this in the piece. Basically, the Democrats had to really run the table and sort of basically rely on a miracle to get to 50 seats, where only the presidency gives them the actual majority in the chamber. They've got 2 completely borrowed seats in West Virginia and Montana. They've got the seat in Ohio, which is challenging to hold. And they've won 2 Senate seats, each in Arizona and Georgia in the last 2 elections, which are states which Joe Biden did win, but which are not exactly, guaranteed to be long-term in the Democratic camp. It could be very competitive. So they basically done very well and sort of maxed out. And there are very few states where they can kind of think they can pick off, a GOP senator. Maybe if Texas continues going blue, they can think about that. Maybe if they could turn the tide in Florida, which has been going the wrong direction. Maybe if they can finally break through in North Carolina. But these are not easy things to do. So the relevance of this is that structurally, given the fact that the Senate is 50 states, regardless of population, it's drawn in a way that, in terms of the current political map, is a really near guarantee of a GOP lead. Not a dramatic lead. It is it's a plus or minus 3, basically. But to do better than that, they really have to get pretty lucky and pretty skilled. And so, if you think about getting rid of the filibuster, if the Democrats' kind of long-term equilibrium is going to be down around 47 seats, they should be thinking hard about whether they want to get rid of the filibuster, because there are few tools that the minority party in the Senate has, and the filibuster is one of them. So, I don't make a recommendation about what they should be doing, but it's something that should enter the calculation as they think about what their strategy is going forward.
Yeah, you can slow down procedural votes. You can't walk out like they could do in Texas, but there's not a whole lot you can do beyond the filibuster besides procedural stuff that can be revised in Senate rules.
Certainly not. I was just wondering, before we move on, is there anything else on this subject that you want to add, Jessica, about the 2 articles or the filibuster itself?
I mean, I agree with Lou. I think the filibuster, I mean, you had, Harry Reid that sort of began the march down this when, they rolled back it for nominees and different things. And then Republicans did it for judicial nominees. So, I mean, it's sort of both parties, they change their tune when they're in power. And I do think that they're not thinking, long term as, sort of our immediacy of politics has. But I do think that, I've often thought the same thing, is that, if you lose the majority, you're going to regret this in a way. So, in the way both parties talk about it, the filibuster is the greatest thing to protect the minority at times, but if you're out of power, it's a complete abuse of power. So, or if you're in power. So I think just that, and then to me, when I look at the 2024 map, I think it all just depends on if those, I think Brown is someone I would see him as less likely to retire, honestly, too. I think he likes being in the Senate. And he certainly likes being
not old by Senate standards.
No.
He's certainly not old by Senate standards.
No. And Joe Manchin, I don't think has liked being, he liked being governor, certainly. But I think he sort of does relish his sort of the role he plays right now, at least, too. And then, Tester does seem to, Montana has sort of a populist bent that, in a way, but we didn't see that happen during a presidential year. So, again, both of those won in 2018 when it was not a presidential year, though. All of 3 of those, and it is. And if this, what held true in 2020, except for Susan Collins, can they be Susan Collins? Essentially, I think is the question. But it would require overcoming a much, much larger margin than she had to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say also in the for that class 3 of the Senate, their previous 3 times they were up were big Democratic years: 2006, 2012, 2018.
Yeah.
Can they count on having a big Democratic year in 2020? I mean, Joe Biden presumably will be on the ballot, and that probably helps, but it's no guarantee. So they've got their work cut out for them.
And you look at Steve Daines' fate in Montana last cycle, which is a race that was really projected to be very competitive, I think squared up to be, and then was ultimately decided by 10 points, which was, I think, surprising. I wasn't that high in that race, but I didn't expect it to 10 points. I expected it to be closer to 5.
Yeah.
If it were to come,
That's one of the 2 states that I do think there was more movement after the Supreme Court vote, that sort of drove that home for a lot of people, too. But
and actually, I was doing the handicapping for the Secretary of State, State AG, and the governor's races. And in addition to the Senate race in Montana, all of those races down the ballot were thought to be pretty competitive going in. And I think I had them in toss-up for a long time, and then I think I probably put them onto the lean GOP side, but still competitive. And none of them was closer than 10 points.
And in 2024, I think it depends on if Trump runs again, too. One of the things, and I think this is important when we're looking at 2022 races as well, and I think for the governors as well, the Trump coalition has not shown up when he is not on the ballot. It did in 2018. It did clearly in 2020, and the polls still, it's hard to measure that, I think. It's just the non-response bias that I think we have seen. But in the same way that the Obama coalition did not show up when he wasn't on the ballot either in 2010 and in 2014. So to me, you do have some of these, races that were closer, that sort of blue wall in Pennsylvania and, Wisconsin that were closer than expected, but we've seen them perform bluer in midterm elections as well. And I think that's why you see. Sorry, what?
If that was a change from the recent past, when it was like the GOP always had the advantage in midterms.
Right.
So with that, unless there are any other major comments, we're going to move on to our final segment before the questions, which is basically going to spend 5 minutes touching on the 3 gubernatorial elections. I think the bulk of the time should be spent on Virginia, the most competitive race. We can hit on the other 2 at the end. I have some things I'll say about New Jersey when you guys are finished. But first off, I'd like to hear, I know our viewers would as well, what you both have to think about the Virginia race.
Jessica, feel free to start.
Yeah, I'm a Virginia resident, and we vote every year. When I moved here, there's no rest when you vote when you live in Virginia. I think certainly Republicans dodged a huge bomb, a huge bombshell there when it wasn't Amanda Chase. I think Pete Snyder still would have been pretty divisive because Chase said she was going to run as an independent in their convention that was kind of seen as chaotic. It produced, I think, the best result that could have come out of that, which is you have Youngkin that has been able to define himself really early. Again, if you're here in the DC media market, I only watch 30 minutes of live television a day typically, and that's Jeopardy, which is primetime viewing hours for especially older voters. There is usually between 2 and 3 very positive Youngkin spots talking about how he started work as a dishwasher and how he got a basketball scholarship. They're very positive ads, and McAuliffe is dark. I think that's a mistake to sort of let Youngkin define himself. They're trying to tie him to Trump at every turn. I do think that, every time Trump has issued a statement or something about this race, I think that's the worst thing that can happen for Youngkin. And I think it's sort of a test of both of these in a way, because Youngkin has had to sort of walk a very fine line of trying to sort of position himself as, sort of a bridge builder, but also when he accepted Trump's endorsement, he's appearing on Fox News, which is not necessarily the strategy you would want to take if you're running in a state like Virginia that has become bluer and bluer, and where Republicans have not won a statewide race since 2009. And I think that is largely the state party has not learned the lessons of the changing demographics of their state in the same way that I don't think really the Georgia Republican Party and the Arizona Republican Party has necessarily, but I think this time they have nominated a stronger candidate who, can clearly self-fund to get that message out. It's still just very hard when the bulk of your vote comes from Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I think when they do start talking about, sort of these, key issues that Youngkin is not as aligned with, it's going to become tougher. The school reopening issue has hit sort of a nerve here in Northern Virginia, though. There's been some backlash in Fairfax and in Loudoun County specifically, and over, Youngkin is sort of really doubling down on critical race theory, even though that's not actually being taught in those school systems. I see that as more sort of a base ginning up issue necessarily, in the same way that, Gillespie talked about the MI-13 gangs and the Confederate statues and different things. So, I think, and we've seen sort of this reflected in the polls where Youngkin can get to, 42, 43, but getting those last few points is really hard. I don't think McAuliffe, even from being a former governor, is a super inspiring candidate to some people. I mean, he did, narrowly win in 2013, though he broke, sort of that curse, the backlight, the opposite party and different things too. But it was much closer against Cuccinelli. That was a divisive candidate. You saw some of the primary opponents bring that up, but they really had no chance at that point. Really, the Democratic primary was very much a snooze, very anticlimactic. And we will see, though, but he left office, very popular. Also, one of the things Youngkin keeps talking about is, bringing back Virginia's rip-roaring economy. That's his buzzword. He uses in all of the ads. And then, last week, CNBC just did a special where Virginia has the best economy in the country. So that you're going to see that in ads and different things. So I think it also, it is ironic to me in a way too, though, when we think back to the past 3 governors, that Terry McAuliffe, the Bill Clinton sidekick and chugging tequila shots on Morning Joe, was the least controversial governor that we've had in the past 3 years. Who would have thought that Bob McDonnell and pretty vanilla Ralph Northam would have had bigger scandals when there was really no major scandal during the McAuliffe administration? So he's sort of campaigning on that sort of return to that. I still think Virginia is still de-leaning, and that's going to win out. But will Youngkin get close? I think he can. But still, the margins that he's going to need in, not just Northern Virginia, but in some of the suburban areas that we see changing, and, Chesterfield County right outside of Richmond and different things. So, but it's really, I do think it's the only competitive governor's race we're gonna have to look at right now too.
And one thing I'd add in is to keep in mind that we, at Elections Daily, we're following this race extensively. Joe Szymanski is constantly interviewing House of Delegates candidates, and the thing that's important to remember with that is the House of Delegate map is heavily skewed towards Republicans, even after it's unskewing redistricting to some degree. It is still skewed towards Republicans. The thought generally is that the closer Youngkin gets to at least a dead even, the better chance Republicans have of retaking, however briefly, because they're going to have to redraw those lines and then run again very, very soon after. That's as close as they get of Republicans of having some chance at control of the legislature. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The closer Republicans have a high base, a high floor in Virginia, but they don't have a very good ceiling at all. They have a pretty low ceiling. Yeah. And so, but that's all part of that is making sure for Republicans that you get close enough in that delegate race to at least try to break even in an 100-member chamber. Although we have it still set to, we project Democrats will probably retain control of the legislature at this point.
Mm-hmm. And also briefly in New Jersey, I think it's important to note, even though we have the race rated as likely Democratic, that Phil Murphy, if he wins re-election, as we're expecting him to win re-election, will break a glass ceiling because he will be the first sitting Democratic governor to win re-election in 44 years. Because if you look back at the history of the state of New Jersey, the last Democratic governor to be re-elected was Brendan Barron, and he was re-elected in 1977. That was a long time ago, and his administration was notable for really being the first one, kind of like McAuliffe, for not having any scandals, which was a miracle in New Jersey politics up to that point, and still is. But if you look at the governors after that, Republican governors have been a lot more successful at re-election. I mean, Tom Kean Sr. had 2 terms. Jim Florio only had 1 term because the backlash. I mean, he ran a close re-election race, but the backlash to New Jersey's tax policy was just too extreme for him to win. Whitman had 2 terms. McGreevey is the only exception, and it doesn't technically count, even though the Democrats held the mansion between McGreevey's first election and Corzine's election, because McGreevey had to resign in scandal. And then Christie obviously had 2 terms. So I think New Jersey's fascinating because traditionally it's been Democrats who have been at the disadvantage on the gubernatorial level, and it's certainly a state where we see to this day Republicans being stronger down ballot. But I think one of the interesting things long-term to look at in New Jersey is it's such an inelastic state. Are we really going to start to see its federal inelasticity trending down to gubernatorial contests, giving Democrats essentially a longer-term advantage going forward? Because ultimately, the Republican base for governor in New Jersey has been diminished just in the last 4 years under Murphy's term. And I think that's going to be fascinating to look at. But just out of an abundance of caution, given it could potentially be anywhere from a 10 to 15-point win, we have it as likely Democratic. Other analysts have it as safe Democratic. But I think that covers that. If you have anything to say on California's crazy show, essentially, please do. Otherwise, we can move on to questions and wrap this up.
I mean, but this is not your 2003 recall.
No,
California has become
greatly changed.
Yeah, and there's no international superstar with like policy chops like there was in 2003. Who is the alternative? So,
and there's no major Democrat that is running in cruise.
That's another thing.
Type thing.
Yeah.
So I've talked to a lot of former Davis people in the past few months, and they really blame that as a big reason too.
Yeah.
I think Davis had his own problems before that, clearly. Even French Laundry and everything too. Newsom's nowhere near where Gray Davis's numbers were. We rated this. We put out our initial rating a few weeks ago. We rated it as likely Democratic at this point, just because it's funky and different things. Yeah. But also not as many candidates. 41 right now, but
only 41.
It's not even. I think you see other candidates like John Cox and. Trying to frame this as like them versus Newsom, but it's really Newsom versus himself, because the first question on the ballot is, do you want to recall him? And if that fails, then the rest of it is moot.
So I think it's interesting, like Lou said, I mean, California is just such a different state than it was back in 2003. Even if you just look at party registration, I mean, if you think about the process, it only takes 12% of the voters in the previous election to trigger a recall. Obviously, far, far off from forming a 50.5% to win a yes vote to recall Newsom. I mean, just the sheer fact, even if every Republican turned out in California, you'd still have to poll drastic numbers of independents to get there. And really, why would Democrats essentially vote to recall a governor, even if he's not particularly popular with them, if all they're going to get is a Republican alternative? And I think that's the big question in such a state that's just become so Democratic.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, California back in 2003 was only 3 years off from being considered potentially competitive in 2000. There was some late action in that
Bush
state.
won it. Kerry won it by only 10 points in 2004, and the 2010 Senate race was close for the whole cycle. Essentially, ended up not panning out for Republicans.
It's a very different state. It is a wildly different state now.
Yeah, the only weirdness about it that is the timing. Being a totally off-cycle election, maybe the turnout will be funky in some way.
But they're mailing ballots to every single registered voter, like they did last time too, though. So I think that can certainly help with low turnout issues too.
Sure.
And there's one other weird element. There's one other weird element, which is that Newsom won't be listed as a Democrat. There is his team failed to file on that somehow, and so he won't be listed as a Democrat. That shouldn't matter.
I don't think he will. If he were on a list of people, I could see that. But he's the governor. You know what party he is.
Yeah.
You
have to be living under a rock.
Yeah.
You'd be more likely if you just know he was in that election, you'll know that he's a Democrat.
I was just about to say that, basically. But without that, if you don't have any other comments on this, we'll spend the last 3-5 minutes or so on any important questions we have. So, Eric, if you want to get started, put up some questions. I think we had 3 or 4 good questions.
Oh, we've had quite a few. The chat has given some really good ones. I'm going to pick out kind of them.
To save time, we could probably go back and forth and have each one of you answer one, unless you both want to chime in, which is perfectly fine.
Yeah, some of these are good. Like, just kind of first one to chime up gets them. I've kind of got them in order here, but the first I think was Jessica mentioned earlier why Arizona had been moved to toss-up. If you wanted to just kind of reiterate that again real quick, that was Paul Lotu, who had asked that pretty early on in the show.
Yeah, and I saw him mention, Brnovich, and I'm not sure Brnovich isn't that strongly candidate. There's still a lot of other candidates in that race, Jim Lamon and different things too. And also, we're also dealing with the fact that you have that you have Johnson, which tying it back to the Almanac for a second. Ron Johnson, I kept putting off his profile to the very end because he would say something crazy again, and I have to include it. So the fact that we went alphabetically by state did help, but I feel like every single day I was, trying to do that, and then had to explain, his COVID denying and the January 6th stuff and everything too. So it's that is a state that Biden won. So he's the only incumbent running for re-election in a state that his party's presidential nominee did not carry. You do have Biden that won that state, that Kelly outperformed him too. So, I think until we get a better idea, I think just Johnson on himself, especially some of the things he said, and just, again, that's distinction there, I think makes it in a more competitive category to start out than Arizona does. And until the Arizona primary and we get some polls there and different things to show it, we're keeping that one in lean D for right now too. And even strategists that I've talked to, they see Kelly as a stronger incumbent, like I said, even perhaps than Hassan, they think at this point too. So
yeah. Makes sense. And the next one is from Brian Elections, who's asked quite a few. I'll go through. I have a couple of his here.
We can alternate also. I can read the next one if that makes it
yeah, I'll put them in the chat here. But I'll put the rest of them in the chat. But basically, the next one's from Brian Elections, who asked, given Ducey's approval ratings aren't as good as they used to be, they're still kind of underwater. Do you think he could still, even if he were to clear a primary, would he still be a good statewide candidate compared to like a Brnovich or someone else along that line?
Well, he's still someone that has demonstrated, electoral crossover votes because he was easily reelected at the same time that Sinema won that race. I mean, would it be a slam dunk that he's going to win? No, but I still think that he's had crossover voting. He's been successful in Maricopa County there. You do see his approval ratings dropping, but a lot of that I do think is among Republicans too. So there would be a question. Smokey wants to weigh in behind me there too. Yes, thoughts on Arizona. Too, but I do think that just he can command, I think, the most money. And again, I just go back to the fact that even though we have seen his approval ratings drop, which, I mean, we saw with a lot of governors sort of hit stratospheric approval ratings at the beginning of COVID. Obviously, Arizona had a really rough spate there too, with, hospitals being full and different things too. And I think that contributed to some of his dip. But I think it's Republicans at this point that have censured him that have been, sort of done that too. And that's why I think I don't think he could win a primary. I don't. So, I mean, I see very little incentive necessarily for him to get in as much as Republicans keep trying.
The other thing too about that is in 2018, he was running against a Democratic candidate for governor who was to the left of his party. Sinema actively distanced herself from him. If you're talking about Ducey against Mark Kelly has more sort of crossover and broad mainstream appeal, I would think, as a Democratic candidate.
Mm-hmm. Although I will think Mark Kelly's going to have a record this time to run on, and that's what Republicans are sort of banking on, and he hasn't been, as vocally moderate as Sinema has been.
Right.
And that way, but I do think, still he has the military astronaut story that is just clearly, as we saw last time, was hard to run
And it's
on.
funny because he's from New Jersey, and in West Orange, where he's from, it was such a big deal last year when he got elected to the Senate. They were celebrating, essentially.
Yeah. And I was going to write an article on this a while back. I got off of it because it was just there weren't too many astronauts. But actually, historically, astronauts haven't been that great at running. I mean, you had Jim Swaggart, who ran and then died before he could take office. You've had a couple other ones running as well that have dropped out.
Jake Garn, Bill Nelson, John.
Yeah. Although Bill Nelson is arguably he went to space, but
he's not
debate.
exactly. Yeah.
I don't know if you could count John Glenn either, since he was the oldest man to go to space after being in office.
And he lost 2 or 3 times in contested Ohio primaries before he got his chance, and a really interesting political figure. But I thought I'd just throw that in.
I don't know. I still see John Glenn as one, given that he helped pilot.
He was,
NASA.
He was the astronaut. That was his image.
Right.
And
I hate to do this, but to bring it back to Pennsylvania, I'm combining 2 questions. Essentially, the gist of this question deals with the 2010 Senate race, so the Toomey Sestak contest. And Brian Elections asks, could Pennsylvania see a scenario similar to 2010 where a Republican who was seen as too conservative during the campaign will manage to pull out a victory? And the follow-up question with that by Sumit Mishra is, in Pennsylvania, out of Barnett, Bartos, and Parnell, who would you consider the strongest Republican contenders in the primary?
Yeah, I will say, let me answer the primary one first, sort of. I've heard the most positive things about Bartos. I will say that he seems to be gaining a little bit. I still think it's just completely unsettled right now, too. And then to go back to the other thing, 2010 was such an incredibly Republican year, too. I think what we are missing in all of this, and we have to miss it, is that we don't know what the environment is going to be like next year. What does the economy look like? What does President Biden's approval ratings look like this time in 2022? We can't know that. And so I think, is inflation hurting him? What about immigration and the border and different things too? So, I mean, one of the best predictors really is of where a president's approval ratings are. And again, we saw that with Obama. We saw that with Trump in the midterm elections. And, while certainly I think that the first presidential midterm I think it's been a better predictor in the House, and we've seen more pronounced losses there rather by the incumbent party than we have in the Senate. It's actually almost an average of 2 between 1 and 2 seats for the party in power. But I think when we look back at 2010, that was such a positive Republican year. Maybe 22 will be for Republicans if Biden's numbers have completely cratered. But and also, I mean, that Democratic primary too, I should say, you have some very progressive candidates that are running in that contest too. That are they too far to the left? I think is a legitimate question as well. So both of those. But I will just say, I mean, we've seen Pennsylvania perform more Democratic in midterm years typically in recent years. But again, is that just a function of 2018? But you had Wolf that won though. In a good Republican year too. So,
granted, that was against Tom Corbett, who made the very poor decision of cutting education spending, which is not a great move.
Yeah.
Quickly, the ticket splitting question that Eric's going to ask at the end for Bryan elections is a great way to close off. So I'm just going to briefly maybe spend like a minute on this question here from Philip White, and it's something I wanted to ask earlier as well, because one thing Jessica was stressing was the sheer number of open seats for Republicans. So do you think that Chuck Grassley will make a decision, and ultimately do you think he will retire? And then also White asked about Patrick Leahy, who is significantly younger than Grassley.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. This is actually the third time I've been asked about Grassley today. It's like the question du jour, because I think when you looked at his fundraising, there'll be a story coming out in the Des Moines Register about this that I was interviewed for. It was less than what he typically has. But as I said, if Chuck Grassley runs, he will have the money that he needs. I think just we look at Iowa from last cycle, too, that Democrats were so high on Teresa Greenfield, and challenging Joni Ernst and challenging a first-term senator is going to be so much different than challenging, an Iowa institution.
Pretty much.
So I don't know what he's going to do, but I will say that, he still runs like 3 miles multiple times a week, and that's 3 more miles than I can run ever. So, he's still pretty spry somehow. But
I mean,
when you get into the 90s, no day is guaranteed, and that's the thing.
Who knows? I mean, it didn't stop Jim Inhofe and Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah.
Let's see.
But I mean, with Feinstein, there's been, certainly questions about her mental acuity and things that are unfortunate too. But I mean, Leahy, there were times, when he was presiding over the impeachment trial that, he seemed a little slow on the intake. I don't know what he's going to do either. Listen, would I be surprised if either of them retire? No, I would not, given their age and where they would be at the end of a, complete term if they made it. But, when you do this, it's the only time someone is like, when you cover these elections, it's like, so they're 90 something. Are they going to retire? I certainly, by the way, hope to be retired when I'm 90. So,
it is a different animal with retirements, not the traditional occupation.
Yeah.
But
I would like to, I hear Vermont and Iowa are both beautiful. I've been to Iowa. I haven't been to Vermont, but enjoy your scenery, enjoy your grandkids. But that's just me.
Eric, do you want to finish it off with the question?
Yeah, I'll just real quick. I'll mention one thing with Vermont, which I know someone's going to mention in the comment. Is the question be if Phil Scott would run? I don't think he would. I think it's ridiculous. There was one ridiculous poll that was put out by a nobody firm. The only thing that would be notable of that would be who would be the second Democrat to represent Vermont in the Senate ever, instead of Pat Leahy at that point, or if it would be another independent affiliated,
People
Democrat.
don't realize just how much
both of these
to win a gubernatorial race than a Senate race.
Yeah, Phil Scott.
Both of these candidates, if they were to step down, their party has lots of options on the bench.
Especially in Vermont. Literally everyone except for Phil Scott, they have people to choose from.
Exactly.
A veritable group of people.
And if Grassley doesn't run, I mean, I think you would have people, Democrats that look at it more seriously, like Cindy Axne or Abby Finkenauer or something. But I do think that clearly, even with an open seat, I still think Ohio would probably be even slightly better.
It would be interesting if Grassley's grandson could continue the institution for like another 40 years or something. Like 80 years of Grassley consecutive.
That's
See if you can pull a full Grassley at some point. I mean,
he's a young guy in his 30s. simply Pat Grassley. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. But towards the last question, since another one from Brian Elections, which is, and I think this is a really interesting question. Do you think it's possible that ticket splitting makes a comeback after the Trump era?
I think it's got a better chance of coming back after the Trump era, but first we have to get past the Trump era, and we're not. As long as he's still talking about running for president in 2024, we're still in the Trump era.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we're still living in the 2020 election. Like, one of the worst things I think Republicans have going for them right now is that they can't fully focus on, attacking Democrats for things when Trump is consistently relitigating the 2020 election, and he is not going to drop it. Instead of moving on, accepting the loss, and it keeps turning back to this, and it's become a litmus test. It is becoming a litmus test in so many of these primaries, and I wonder too, and I think this plays into perhaps Pennsylvania and North Carolina, the states that were really close to. Some of those people maybe voted for Trump, and we've seen, in North Carolina, especially some of the registration changes from, to unaffiliated from Republican too. What does January 6th and the aftermath of that have too? So.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I've mentioned just in particular, is when you look back at 2018, what were the effective attacks Democrats had? It wasn't looking back on the 2016 election as sort of the Russia stuff. That probably wasn't what got me. It was the practical healthcare stuff. It was the tax cut, the tax plan. It was other things along that line. To some degree, the Supreme Court probably brought up some of their base voters. That was the practical stuff.
That, they could act as a brake against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't we're going to relitigate 2016 Russia, all that stuff. That was a base motivator, but that's not what caused people to go out and vote for a Democrat in South Carolina 1 or Oklahoma 5.
Yeah, you have Mo Brooks, you have Josh Mandel out there completely still saying that the election was stolen.
Mm-hmm. It's what works better for voters, what convinces them, and I think that's a good place to end off on. I guess is looking forward in that angle is we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we do. The closer we get to election day and the more these primaries progress, we'll have a better idea of where this is ultimately going. And the Almanac does reflect a lot of what we're seeing right now after the 2020 election.
I will say one final anecdote from when we were writing. A lot of our research was actually done prior to January 6th and given to us. And then I think virtually every senator that I was having, because I wrote Richard Burr and Bill Cassidy. So, I had to do some additional research and pull different things too, because obviously if I had, worked on their profiles prior to January 6th, what their profiles lead with, which you can probably guess, would have been very different too. So you're going to see a lot of the, fallout and how it affected some of these senators reflected, I think, in this as well. And I'm sure the House members as well that, perhaps cross the party lines too.
Mm-hmm. But if no one else has any comments, I think we'll officially wrap up the stream. Eric just posted the discount code again. Once again, Almanac Tweet 22, 15% off discount for the 50th edition. Make sure you go to the Almanac of American Politics website, which is listed in the link to purchase it. But again, thank you so much to Jessica Taylor and Lou Jacobson for coming on today. Wonderful to have this report episode, probably the most fascinating one we've had up to this point. And thank you to our viewers as well for watching.
And for your great questions.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, guys.